welcome all the colleagues who are attending this program, this webinar on at 1:30 in the afternoon, which is pretty much lunchtime for a lot of people. But we are doing this because Professor Briner, our speaker, is based out of London, and he suggested that we do it at a time which is both convenient for him and us. So thank you, Professor Briner, for nudging us to try some experiment with the time, and it seems like it works. So what so let me just first introduce Professor Briner and then open this and then have us hear him. Professor Briner is a professor of organizational psychology in the School of Business and Management, Queen Mary University of London. He conducts research into several areas of organizational psychology and HR, such as work and well-being, the psychological contract, work, non-work relationships, and ethnicity. In addition, he's very active in developing evidence-based practice in management, HR, and organizational psychology. And that's really why we invited him, because he's not just doing research that's being published in academic journals, but he's also working with practitioners, which makes it part of the mandate of Ashank Desai Centre for Leadership and Organizational Development. Professor Briner is also the member of the Centre for Research in Equality and Diversity at the university. He has been a founding member, vice chair, and now scientific director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, which through its teaching, training, and dissemination activities aims to help managers make better decisions by adopting principles of evidence-based practice. Professor Briner teaches at the university courses on evidence-based management. He has received several awards for his work in the area, including British Psychological Society Division of Occupational Psychology and Academic Contribution to Practice Award, and has topped HR Magazine's Most Influential Thinker list in 2016. He also is a visiting faculty in other universities, such as the Institute of Psychiatry and the London School of Economics, a professorial fellow at the University of Edinburgh Business School, and honorary fellow at the Institute of Employment Studies. Professor Briner, it's really an honor for us to welcome you here and have you amidst us sharing your ideas and the work that you do, which I think is at the heart of what ADCLOD is meant for academia and practice to meet together, and for practitioners to use some of the insights that we develop in academia and make workplaces and people's lives better. So thank you very much, and the stage is yours now.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to come and talk to you today. And I'm sorry for interrupting your lunch. Lunch is very important to me, but it's going to be my lunch in a few hours. So yes, I want to talk about evidence-based practice and evidence-based management. And I'm going to do this by really, I guess, using evidence-based HR as the example. I'll talk about some of the benefits of it, some of the challenges, and the role of leaders in promoting evidence-based HR and evidence-based management in organizations. And I'm quite happy if you've got any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat and your colleagues will relay those questions to me. So I'm very happy. Anything you want to ask as we go along, very happy to answer that. Okay, 1 second. Right. So I want to talk first about an example that illustrates what a well-informed decision means. So sometimes when people look at evidence-based practice, they think, oh, that's very technical. You have to know a lot about statistics. You have to be a scientist or a brainiac. Well, you don't really. And the principles of evidence-based practice, which I'll go on to discuss in a moment, really, I think they come from what we do in everyday life when a decision is really important to us. This is an example of a decision that will be really important to me. Maybe not to you, but if you're very interested in food, where you eat, what you eat is a very, very important decision. So this example is that, say, I arrive in a large European city. let's say Amsterdam. I don't know it very well. I get there late Tuesday afternoon. I check into my hotel, and when I get to my room, my hosts, who are going to want to pay for dinner, I'm their guest, they say choose any restaurant you want, anywhere in the city, any kind of cuisine. We are paying, and they insist that you choose. And if, like me, you really, really enjoy eating in restaurants and you want to have a good dinner that you will enjoy, how would you decide which restaurant to book? So you're in the hotel room, it's maybe 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening, you've got to sort of try and make a decision, and you are relaxed and you genuinely know that they want to buy you dinner, and you genuinely know they're really happy for you to choose wherever you want. So how would you go about trying to decide? Well, if you think about this situation, and it might apply to other situations like moving to a new city or changing career, something that's kind of maybe important, are you more likely to get a good dinner if you use, number one, no evidence or some evidence? Well, clearly, if you use some evidence. Are you more likely to get a good dinner if you use one source of evidence or multiple sources? And again, multiple sources is better. So if I was doing this, you may do something different. I would look on the internet. I might look at Google reviews. I might think about TripAdvisor. I might speak to a concierge. I might look at newspaper reviews. I may look at other sources. I may go on to restaurant websites and look at the menus and look at pictures of the food. So I'll get multiple sources of evidence. And point three, am I more likely to get a good dinner if I use the information without awareness of its trustworthiness or with awareness? Well, clearly, the more aware I am of how trustworthy that evidence is, again, I'm more likely to get a good dinner. So, for example, TripAdvisor, in my view, in my experience, is very unreliable. A concierge in a hotel may also be very unreliable because typically a concierge is paid to give recommendations of local restaurants. So it doesn't mean you don't ask the concierge, but you may say, well, I'm not too sure about that. So being aware of how trustworthy is really important. And is it better to use a sort of unstructured, random approach, opening hundreds of browser windows, or is it better to take a structured approach, like starting to make a list? So in this case, I think obviously making a list, taking a structured approach will be better. And in this example, you see the main principles of evidence-based practice, which I'll go on to discuss in a minute. So the choosing a dinner may not work for you, but there may be other kinds of decisions where that does work. One example people often talk about is if they're buying a product, maybe a consumer product, and they really want to make sure they get something that's going to really work for them. They may, again, look at multiple sources, think about trustworthiness, and so forth. Let's take a step back and think about the purpose of any profession. It could be manager, it could be human resource professional, it could be any kind of professional. What's a profession for? Essentially, it's to help its clients and customers. And how can we most effectively do that? I think we can only effectively do it by understanding two things. Number one, what are the most important issues faced by our clients and customers? So we want to understand when we're dealing with our clients, what is most important for them? How can we help identify with them what is most important? Secondly, once those issues are discovered, what interventions are most likely to help resolve those issues? And to put it really simply, the more accurate our understanding of those two things, the more effective we're going to be as professionals. And evidence-based practice has been applied to many fields and professions to help practitioners develop a more accurate answer to those two questions. So these are just some of the fields where professionals and professional bodies have tried to adopt some of the principles of evidence-based practice, which I'll talk about in a moment, to their work. And as you'll see, they're quite wide-ranging, from things like architecture to healthcare management, to philanthropy, to medicine, to policymaking, to education, even to policing. So the principles of evidence-based practice really apply across a wide range of professions and area of practice, even though the issues they're dealing with might be slightly different, and even though the evidence and data they might be using will be slightly different. It kind of doesn't matter. The principles are still the same. And what about HR in particular? Well, of course, as you're aware, there have been historical and ongoing concerns about how historical concerns about how much HR is actually helping the business. So is HR actually helping the business? Is it just a cost center? Is it helping or not? And how can the HR profession do better? It can do better by, again, doing those two things, improving our understanding of the most important issues for the business and identifying solutions that are most likely to work. And I think in HR, as in some other professional fields, there is now a widespread acceptance that we need to make better use of evidence and data to increase our effectiveness. When I first started talking about evidence-based practice in management and HR, for example, maybe several decades ago, a lot of practitioners didn't necessarily agree, and they thought they were doing a great job and they didn't need to use any more data and evidence. And I think for a range of reasons, particularly things like the use of more data, the things around people analytics, I think many professionals now are aware they could be using data and evidence much better. So in a way, my job has got a bit easier because there's more acceptance of that more generally. So what is evidence-based HR? And this also defines evidence-based management, I would say. It's a process. So the most important thing about evidence-based HR is it's a process. It's not about the outcome, it's about a process. And it delivers more informed and more accurate answers, again, to those same questions. What are the most important things facing the organization? And once we discover those, what can we do about it? What is most likely to help? And to make it even simpler, we can just say two questions: what's going on and what can we do about it? And it may sound very simple, and in a way it is. And I'll go on to give you an example. In a way it's simple. It's hard to do, though. Not because it's complicated, because there are many barriers and things that get in the way, sometimes including leadership, of being evidence-based as an organizational practitioner. But those questions, what's going on and what can we do about it, are answered through a combination of using the best available evidence and critical thinking. And these are the three principles, and you may recognize them from the choosing a restaurant example: multiple sources and types of evidence, structured approach, and a focus on the most trustworthy and the most relevant evidence. So let's think about principle one. And those of you are on the webinar today who are practitioners, you may want to reflect on how often you do that. How often, when you're trying to identify an issue or trying to identify a solution, do you actually incorporate multiple sources and types of evidence? Now, for some people, this may be obvious, but it isn't for everyone. Why is it important to incorporate multiple sources of evidence? I think an example here might be if you go and see a family doctor, and it would also apply to the dinner example too. But imagine you are not well and you go and see your doctor, and she tells you she's going to diagnose and treat you only by getting data or evidence from you, and only a certain kind of evidence. So she's going to go blood test, MRI scans, CT scans, other diagnostic. That's all she's going to use to both diagnose and treat you. She's going to ignore all the evidence from medical science. She's going to ignore her professional expertise as a doctor, and she's going to ignore what you as a patient or a stakeholder believe and feel. If you went to see this doctor, you'd be a bit surprised, and you'd think she maybe wasn't going to do a very good job, because she really should look at those other sources. And that's why multiple sources are so important. And I would say one of the key strengths of evidence-based practice is this idea you incorporate multiple sources and multiple types of evidence and data to get more accurate answers. And it's absolutely essential kind of part of it. So that's the first principle. And you might want to think about what the main sources and types of evidence are in management, I think, and evidence-based HR, and indeed leadership. And these are, I would say, the four main sources: stakeholder views, your professional expertise as a practitioner, evidence from inside the organization, and external evidence, including scientific evidence. So if you look at the top right here, you'll see stakeholder views. That could be the senior management team, the senior leadership. It could be customers. It could be employees. It could be line managers. So these are people that are stakeholders in the decision you're trying to make, in understanding what's the problem and what we can do about it. That's the first area. The second area in the bottom right is professional expertise. That's not just your professional expertise, but it may also be the expertise of other experts who can maybe help you understand what's the issue and what can be done about it. The third area in the bottom left is evidence from inside the organization. And that would be some things like HR metrics in the case of HR, KPIs, it could be surveys, customer satisfaction, the structures and processes, and maybe the results of experiments or things you've tried within the business. The fourth area, top left, is peer-reviewed scientific publications, for example. Scientific evidence may be collected by professional bodies, some kinds of benchmarking from external organizations, and perhaps case studies of other organizations that have faced similar kinds of issues or problems. So these are the four main sources of evidence, and you see that within them, there are many different types of evidence as well. So that was the first principle. The second principle is to adopt a structured and explicit process of gathering. And you might want to think again about how often, if you're a practitioner or a manager or an HR professional, how often do you actually adopt a structured and explicit approach to gathering and using evidence? So my sense is that everybody always uses evidence. Everybody's used evidence and data, but firstly, they may not use multiple sources. And secondly, they do not tend to adopt a structured and explicit approach of gathering it. Sure, they'll get data, they'll get evidence, they'll think about stuff, they'll talk to people, but it's not particularly structured. And the question is then, why is it important to adopt a structured and explicit approach? There's several reasons, but essentially there are lots of barriers to making well-informed decisions. When you're trying to make a well-informed decision, lots of things can get in the way. And the four in bold here, I'm going to talk about shortly, but things like politics and power get in the way. Incentives get in the way. We're often incentivized to just do stuff instead of doing what might help a well-understood problem or issue. Sometimes, again, a bias to action. It's this, we just want to do stuff. Another issue is that sometimes there's a perceived need for speed. Again, similar to this bias for action. We just do things. Often we have strong and wrong beliefs, and this is particularly true in HR. Senior leaders, HR practitioners, line managers often have very strong beliefs about what, for example, motivates people at work, or how what kind of rewards are appropriate, or what kind of training might be effective. And often these beliefs are just wrong. And again, that's another barrier gets in the way. Without taking a structured approach, it may be that some beliefs override other sources of evidence and data. So there are many things that get in the way. So a structured approach is very, very important. And I'll break this down in a minute, but this is with CRF, this is the kind of structure we've adopted. Again, part one on the left is what's the issue. And once you've gone through that, part two on the right is what can we do about it. And two other parts of that structure are at the top of it, you can see it says awareness of important business issue. So evidence-based practice, evidence-based HR, evidence-based management always starts with, is this an important issue? Somebody's told me there's an indication there's some important thing perhaps for the business or organization going on here. It starts with that awareness. And once you trigger that awareness, you then have to consider what the issue might be. And once you've done that, you then think, what can we do about it? And again, at the end of that process, you would implement an intervention if required and think about the evaluation. So there's a two-part process. Principle 3, focus on the most trustworthy and relevant evidence. And again, if you're a practitioner, it's really worth reflecting on this. So as I mentioned, people do always use evidence and data. They don't necessarily do it in a structured way. They don't necessarily use multiple sources. And also
Rob,
they don't
Rob, there's a question. There's a question. And the question is, how time consuming is this approach, and are leaders willing to spend that much time and effort?
That's a fantastic question, and I'll come on to it in detail later because people always ask this, and I'll just answer it briefly now. If I'm sitting in that hotel in Amsterdam trying to choose a restaurant for me to get a good dinner, if I only have 5 minutes, am I more to do that process? Am I more likely to get a good dinner than if I don't do it at all? 5 minutes will increase the chances I'll get a good dinner. 10 minutes will probably increase it even more, but maybe after an hour and a half, it's not going to make any difference. So it's a great question. And my answer is always, it takes the time you've got. It depends how much time you've got. So even doing it quickly and not thoroughly, you're still more likely to say, what is the issue? and what is the solution? But it's a great question. And I think it's one of the barriers for people to do this, because they look at the model and go, oh my God, that's going to take me 400 years to do, or 40 months, and so they just forget about it. But that is not the point. The point is about making a more informed decision, not a perfect decision, because there aren't perfect decisions anyway. So thank you very much. Great question. Thank you. Keep them coming, please.
Thank you.
So as I was mentioning, people they don't tend to think about the most trustworthy and relevant evidence. They probably just throw it all in the mix and make a decision on that basis. So why is it important to focus on the most trustworthy? Well, essentially, we are surrounded by data and evidence of many types from many sources, and that is particularly true now. So after the internet, after the data revolution, AI, we're surrounded by data and evidence. But some, if not most of it, is not trustworthy. Some, and sometimes most of it, is not relevant. It's great, there's lots of it, but it doesn't answer our questions. So including untrustworthy and irrelevant evidence will not lead to better informed decisions, but worse informed decisions. So focusing on most trustworthy, again, is a really important part of it. So what I'm going to do now is just give you one quick example, not of both parts, just of part one of this process. So let's apply evidence-based HR to a presenting problem of high employee turnover. So you may be a leader, you may be a manager, you may work in HR, and somebody tells you, or you get some data that says, oh, we seem to have a problem here. Our turnover is too high. So let's find out if it is and what's going on. So you ask answerable questions, point 1.1, you gather evidence of different types, you look at how trustworthy it is, you pull together the most trustworthy and relevant to answer the question, what is the issue? And then you reflect on the process. So this is just stage one. So stage 1.1 is asking answerable questions. So what exactly is this presenting problem of high employee turnover? For example, where is it happening? Who is leaving? What actually is the rate? Are the trends? How does our turnover rate compare to similar organizations? Why is turnover even a problem? Why is it a problem for us here? What might be the consequences? What might explain this turnover? So this is about asking answerable questions. Then you look across the four sources I already mentioned to collect data that will help you answer those questions to understand the problem of high turnover. And generally speaking, I think you start by gathering evidence from stakeholders, because often they are the most important people in terms of having a view. They may not be correct, but about what's going on. And then you can move on to other sources and devise a method for recording and storing the evidence. It doesn't need to be fancy. A Word document is fine. It doesn't have to be any fancier than that. Then you rate the trustworthiness and you ask questions like, do you understand the evidence? How was it gathered? Is it likely to be biased? How credible is this source? And how do we know that? Given our questions, which evidence is most trustworthy? And given our questions, which evidence is most relevant to our particular context? And then sometimes people argue you should do a triage. Which evidence should you definitely use, maybe use, and not use? Then you're left with evidence that's most relevant and most trustworthy. Then you pull together to answer those questions. Where is the turnover happening? Who is leaving? What is the rate? How does our rate compare to others? Pull it together. And then 1.5 to answer that question, what exactly is the issue? So we started with the presented problem of high turnover, but given the available evidence, what's the accurate answer to each of our questions? And then what is the problem? Is it a problem? Is it one turnover problem or several different problems? Are the turnover problems serious? Do we even need to intervene? You may conclude that, yes, there is turnover, but it's not that high. It's not a problem. Okay, then we don't go on to stage two. And then you reflect on the process and the decision outcome to help your learning around this process and your answers to the questions. And then you do the same thing if you discovered a turnover problem or problems. You do exactly the same thing to think about what interventions might work to try and reduce that turnover. And then implement an intervention and plan it. So I won't talk about that now. So it's worth reflecting on, I think, what I think are the 8 benefits of evidence-based HR and evidence-based practice and evidence-based management more generally. And they are that it helps the ability of HR to be more effective, or any practitioner. It helps us focus on business issues, organizational problems, not just things we think are interesting. It helps us mitigate risks. There are many things HR management does that have risks, but unless we go through this kind of evidence-based process, we won't really understand what the risks are. It allows us to prioritize. HR management leaders cannot do everything, so we must prioritize. So understanding the most important issues is really important. It increases the value and credibility of HR, and it reduces the waste of resources. Management HR often asks employees to do things that turn out to be pretty much a waste of time. And this loses us goodwill, it wastes money, it wastes effort. So we shouldn't be wasting valuable resources. It also enhances ethical standards, because what it means is you're more aware of what the nature of the problem is and what the effects of what you do might be. And also it helps learning and development of the HR function and an organization in general, because through going through this process multiple times, you get a much better understanding of how to understand most important issues and what you can do, and the data and evidence you have around you and how it can be used. So the benefits, I think, are incredibly important. So I'll pause for a moment, and if there's any other questions, and maybe just, yeah, please.
So Rob, there is a question here. I actually came in the beginning, but I thought I'd ask you now. So this is Vikas who's asking that if you could persuade every CHRO to adopt just one evidence-based habit tomorrow, what it would be, and how could it create the biggest organizational impact?
I think I would say the most important, if it was one, and I think it's really important there isn't just one, but if you're going to make me choose one, I would say the most important thing is to really understand what the most important business issues is first. So CHROs, like lots of leaders and lots of managers, they have a bias towards action. They want to do stuff. They don't want to think about what the issue is. And when I do training on this, we might have a whole day. I might work with a team and I'll say, okay, in the morning, we're going to think about what are the most important issues facing the organization. We're going to think about the evidence and data for that. And then we're not going to discuss interventions or solutions. In the afternoon, we're going to do that. And you can guess what happens. Within about half an hour in the morning session, everybody wants to talk about solutions. And I keep saying, but you haven't understood what the issues are yet. So the most important thing is deliberately say, we're not going to talk about solutions or interventions. We're going to set time to actually really understand the problem. I think if there was one thing, I don't think there is one thing, but if there is one, it will be that. So again, good question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Yeah.
So you may already be getting a sense of how leadership may be relevant to this whole process, not just in HR, but more generally about evidence-based practice and how leaders can play a role. Now, I'll return to that kind of in a moment. So I think it's also worth considering how much we do already. Does it seem too complicated? And as one of the first questions was, is it too time-consuming? So I would say if it's a really important business or organizational issue, then it is worth investing time because it saves resources and reduces errors. So sometimes people say about health and safety, if you think evidence-based HR is expensive or time-consuming, try the alternative. So what I see again and again and again is organizations doing stuff that is trying to address a problem they haven't really understood. And what that means is the thing they do hasn't really had any effect. And they keep doing it and doing it and doing it. It's a huge waste of resources. If you spend more time thinking about the issue is first and what's more likely to work, in the end, it saves you time and resources. But it does also depend on access and data and the function's capacity to deal with evidence and data. And that varies quite a lot. But as I mentioned in relation to the restaurant example, choosing dinner, even doing it quickly and only parts of it, you're still more likely to understand the issue and identify a solution. And even if you do it fast and miss out parts of it, you're still more likely to understand the issue and identify a solution. So it's okay to miss out parts, but understand that's what you've done, and that's okay. And as I said, it's about making better informed, not perfect decisions. Is there any more? I noticed some stuff coming from the chat. Is there any more questions?
There is a question here which says, can evidence-based HR practice become so data-driven that it overpowers factors such as trust? And do you think that would be beneficial or harmful?
Factors such as trust. If trust an issue, that's part of the data. So I would say things like employee trust or employee concerns or employee perceptions, that's all part of the data. So evidence-based practice isn't just about using, say, quantitative data. It's about employee perceptions and views about what they think is going on. So no, it's part of it. You wouldn't ever override it. It'd be part of that mix. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, makes sense.
So these are some FAQs about evidence-based HR. Do you have to do it for everything? No. Do you have to follow every single part? No. Do you have to gather evidence from all four sources? No. People are often concerned about a very common question: what are things like experiments or innovation or trying new things? Well, experiments and innovation and trying new things come about at the end of an evidence-based HR and evidence-based management process. If you've identified a problem really well, and you've identified that two solutions might equally work, great, do an experiment. If you've identified that all the available solutions don't seem to work at all, then you need to innovate. So the experiments and innovation absolutely have a place, but it's at the end of this process and not a replacement for it. And also things like, should you integrate it with project planning? Absolutely, it should become part, ideally, of the way you work. So I'm going to talk about some barriers now.
So there are a couple of questions.
Great, please, yeah.
So one says, how can we prescribe perception as data? How can we transcribe perception as data?
How can you transcribe it? Well, if I say to you, I'm really hungry, isn't that data? You then might think, oh, are you really hungry, Rob? Do you want some food? Yes. What would you like to eat? Oh, I don't know yet. Let me think about it, or whatever. So I'm using a food example again. I hope this isn't making you hungry, but all that kind of stuff. An emotion is data. Someone's upset, someone's angry. A group of employees say they are, really angry with the company. That's data. So you don't necessarily need to quantify it all. You can if you want, but sometimes knowing that there is a perception, there's a view, there's a feeling, someone is saying something, that gives you a clue that there's something you need to pay attention to and to investigate more. So again, I think it's evidence-based. Let's go back to the family doctor example. The family doctor will be using all kinds of different evidence and data, including talking to you. They'll be talking to you and see how you feel, and they'll take that into account in terms of their understanding of what's going on for you and what they should prescribe or suggest in terms of an intervention. So again, it's part of the mix, I would say.
There is another question here which says, do you think that in today's times, data and data analytics is replacing all other evidences?
Yeah, that's a really good question again. So I think there is a danger. So I'd certainly say it's in HR. There's a danger that certain kinds of data and certain approaches to analyzing data are seen as the one only best way of doing it. But again, I think I hope the family doctor example illustrated, people analytics and that kind of analytics is just using one source. And you would say to that doctor, you're not a very good doctor if you don't take account these other sources. I say exactly the same thing to HR professionals and HR functions. If you're only looking at your internal data and only doing people analytics, it's not enough. It's really important, but it's only part of it. Yeah. But I think there is a tendency for people to say, oh, we've got fancy data, fancy models, that's all we need. It isn't all you need. It isn't. But I can see there might be that tendency. So again, really good question.
Yeah. And so Rob, a question from my side. When I hear you say what you're saying, it seems very much like what I would do when I would do an organizational diagnosis. If I'm going to go look at a problem, turnover, dissatisfaction, that I would do. So how is this a little different? Or is it really the same thing?
Okay, so the thing about evidence-based practice in general across all those professions is it's not new. And it doesn't have to be new, and it shouldn't be new. It's drawing on what people already do. So in the case of organizational diagnosis, or some people talk about working in an agile way, has lots of overlapping things with other ways in which people practice. I'd say the main differences are those three principles: multiple sources of evidence and data, taking a structured approach, and paying attention to the best quality data and information. Now, other approaches contain some of those elements for sure, but I don't think any of those other approaches contain all three. And to me, that's the core of evidence-based practice. So it absolutely overlaps. And let me put it another way. Whenever people are concerned about the outcome of their decision and the outcome of their understanding, they tend to do some of these things. Evidence-based practice tries to put them all together. That makes sense.
Sure, that makes sense, yeah. Because that's also a very good part of how we look at organizations and their problems, people-related problems, especially. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And just this framework and model just helps you do it in a bit more of a systematic way, I think. Yeah.
And there is another question here where somebody's saying, does evidence-based HR possibly, could it suffer from errors of stereotyping and prejudice? And if yes, how do we overcome it?
Okay, so I'm not sure stereotype and prejudice around what, but generally the bias part is that the part of the process where you think about how trustworthy the evidence and data are is the point at which you're thinking about are the biases in the data, including stereotyping. So it's at that point that you'd start to think about, have biases, whatever form of biases, have they crept into these data or not? And again, this is why doing evidence-based HR in a team is really important, because often we are not very good at spotting our own biases. Other people are quite good at spotting our biases. So again, evaluating the trustworthiness of the evidence, it's really important to do it with other people. Yeah. But there absolutely is that danger. All data is biased in different kinds of ways. So the key thing is how is it biased and what can you do about that?
Do you want to go on? There are a couple more questions.
Let me go on a bit. I'll just take about 5 more minutes.
Please.
That's okay. So I was just going to talk about some of the barriers. So one of them is misconceptions. So these are things that these barriers get in the way of people using evidence-based practice. And we've actually heard some of these is totally reasonable in the questions people have been asking, which is great. It takes too much time. We can't innovate. It's too hard. It's the same as people analytics. It's all about hard data. None of these things are correct. But if you believe them, then it will stop you from being interested in evidence-based practice, evidence-based HR. The second barrier, I think, again, this goes right across lots of areas of practice in organizations, is fads and fashions. So they're pretty common. They're very distracting. They encourage something called solutioneering, which is you define a problem by the absence of a solution. So you might say, oh, wouldn't it be great to have a talent management program? So you look for problems that might be solved by a talent management program just because you want to do it because everybody else is doing it. And it makes it difficult to make informed decisions as you would have a solution to a non-identified problem. So fads are really, I think a real issue in management in general and HR. And what we've developed at CRF is this red flags for fads. So if you're engaged in a practice now, it's worth looking at these red flags. And if you've probably got more than 5 or 6 or 7 of them, it's quite likely the thing you're doing is a fad and probably will not help. So fads tend to be attractive, they're simple, they're prescriptive, they're falsely encouraging, they promise to have these panacea effects, one size fits all, they're easy to cut and paste, they're in tune with the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, they're novel, not radical, they sound new, but only superficially different, they're legitimized by gurus, disciples, and cool organizations. The credibility of a fad comes from people like influencers and superstar businesses rather than evidence. They're FOMO-inducing, fear of missing out. This fear of missing out means, oh my God, we've got to do this thing because everyone else is doing it. The idea of not following it creates this fear, so you tend to do it. And also the without focus purpose. The question for which problem is this practice the answer can be very difficult to answer if the practice is a fad. So this is a checklist we developed to help people get a sense of, are these practices fads? Are they genuinely going to help us?
Nice.
So this is just one way of thinking about it. So I won't talk about that now, but there's some examples on the slides of fads. Another example I want to talk about briefly is something called theatre. And you get it in management as well, management theatre, you get it in government, you get it in lots of situations. It's adapted from the idea of security theatre. This came in after 9/11. So it was defined then, security theatre was measures that make people feel more secure without doing anything to actually improve their security. So you get a large number of initiatives, some might be effective, many unlikely to be, and some may do more harm than good. So the security theatre idea came from the TSA in the US and the governments, where they introduced lots and lots and lots of things to try and make people feel safe. So more screening, having people with guns on planes, all these things about liquids, how much liquid, all that. So pretty quickly though, people described it as theatre. So it's designed to make travelers feel kind of better. And the idea of this has been extended to other areas. A lot of actions and activities are theatre, they're performative. So this comes from, and you may recognise that the person at the bottom right, that's one of our previous Prime Ministers, Boris Johnson, but it's just an example. Here he is cleaning a chair. And there's a lot of, again, I don't know in your situation or your context, but in the UK, there's a lot of time spent giving people wipes to wipe down surfaces, to clean things with, and the problem is that is not effective with the COVID-19 virus because it's spread through air. It's not spread via surfaces. So I was in situations where everybody was wiping the tables and wiping the chairs and wiping the door handles, but all the windows were shut. So the idea of security theatre or this kind of theatre is it gives the impression something is being done to help when it isn't. But of course, you get this in other areas such as HR. So it happens in HR, happens in management. It's unlikely to help employees or the organisation. Things like examples like unconscious bias training, mental health first aid, annual performance appraisals. They're given the impression that something's being done, but these things are not very effective. Sometimes people say, well, it can't do any harm, but that's not defensible because even doing harmless things has secondary harmful effects. It wastes people's time. It gives the impression something's being done, and it distracts people from the real causes of problems and their solutions. So again, cleaning a surface when you need ventilation, it distracts people. And also it can cause cynicism, and it gets in the way of development of HR as a function because the focus becomes on impression management. In the case, for example, of learning development, the impression is, look at all the learning and development we're doing. We've now got 500 online courses our employees can do. Absolutely meaningless, but it gets into this theatre kind of idea. So that's another barrier. I won't talk about barrier 4 now, but you can have the slides afterwards. It's around cognitive biases. I won't talk about that now. So how can you get over these barriers? Well, misconceptions, you can learn more about it. Fads and fashions, you can use things like the fad detector checklist. HR theatre, ensure that what you're doing is always linked to a real issue or problem. And for the cognitive biases, which I didn't talk about now, I think you have to slow down. Don't just believe what you read or hear. Get data from other sources to check what it is you think you're seeing or hearing or reading. So how do we get started? We have many resources at CRF to help. And I think always focus on diagnosis and the issue first, as I mentioned. The best way to learn in general is by doing. I think this is a really good example. If you start doing this, you just learn how to do it. You can't do it on your own. You need a team, build it into planning. And the key question you have to ask, in this case as an HR professional, is do you genuinely want to get better at helping the business? If you do, you need something very much like evidence-based HR, if not evidence-based HR itself. And also remember the benefits. There are many benefits of adopting this process. So what about leadership? And this is something I've dealt with quite a lot when working with teams around it and organizations in general. The first thing, it can be very challenging to some leaders who may see evidence-based practice as questioning their authority. Some leaders do not like the idea that somebody lower down the hierarchy can wave some evidence and data and say, oh, I know you think that was a problem, it isn't. Or I know you think that wasn't a problem, but look, I think it is a problem. Some leaders hate that. So they can be a real barrier to evidence-based practice. But if they're not going to be a barrier, they can role model it. So they can ask questions, they can ask others questions, they can avoid this bias to action, and they can ask their teams for evidence and data. So one leader I know always says in her meeting, she said, look, we're going to talk about this issue, but next meeting, everyone who wants to present this has to come with evidence and data about what you think the problem is and why. And you have to share it with us. We're not just going to go blah, blah, blah and talk about it for an hour. You have to come with evidence and data. Reminds me of that quote, God we trust, all of us must bring data. It's that kind of idea. I think also leaders can promote evidence-based HR both within and outside their team. Again, some leaders I know in HR have done a great job in saying to the rest of the business, we are an evidence-based HR practice. This is the way we work. Here is the model. This is the way we do things in this function. And they actually explain it and tell people that's how they're doing. Also, leaders have to be humble, of course, accept there's many things they do not know. And also acknowledge when things do not work. And again, a key part of evidence-based practice is stopping things when they don't work. And again, leaders may help with that. Leaders may get in the way. They may want things to carry on because they've started them and it's their baby. They want to keep it going. You have to be prepared similarly to stop doing things that don't work. And also you have to support a team to build capacity and capability in doing this. So finally, last slide, people often say to me, well, are there any alternatives to evidence-based practice? If we're not going to be evidence-based HR or evidence-based management, what's the alternatives? But I think there are a few alternatives. The first is eminence-based HR, where the views of the most senior and experienced members of the function, the hippos, the highest paid person's opinion, that makes the decisions. So a bit like a certain kind of leader. The second alternative is vehemence-based HR, where activity is driven by those opinions expressed with the greatest volume, force, and confidence. The third is eloquence-based HR. It's whoever can be a smooth talker, has the gift of the gab, is really persuasive. That drives decisions. Obedience-based HR, just doing what you're told. That's an alternative. Another alternative is resemblance-based HR, just copying what other organizations do without thinking, unthinking benchmarking. Defense-based HR, just do whatever's the safest, doing the thing that's least likely to get us into trouble. That's another alternative. Indolence-based HR, think about how hard it's going to be, level of effort, and choose whichever course of action is easiest. Haste-based HR, time is the most important thing. Whatever can be done quickly determines what gets done. Indulgence-based HR, choosing to do whatever you think you're most likely to enjoy doing the most and doing that. And finally, reverence-based HR, looking around for whatever you feel is the coolest or most amazing or truly awesome thing, and then just doing that. So there are many alternatives to evidence-based HR. I think they're not very attractive. I don't think they help us as professionals, and I don't think they help the organizations we're trying to serve. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice. Thank you so much. Can I just ask a couple of the questions that are
Please.
there? Yeah, and then we can go further. So there is a question which says that organizations that are, in the current place where there's so much change and so much innovation happening around, can innovation-driven companies effectively implement evidence-based HR? Because things are changing very rapidly, and there is very limited historical data and no industry benchmarking.
Right. So it depends really about innovation, because I think the idea is that innovations don't come from the air. They don't come randomly. They come from evidence and data. So it depends what you think innovation is. It's not normally an accident. It's not normally a mistake. It's because it's there to meet a particular purpose, and it's bringing things together in particular ways. So I think in terms of the innovation piece, I think you don't necessarily need historical data to make judgments about innovations, although it can be quite useful. And in terms of the things changing rapidly, yeah, of course, things are often changing quite rapidly. And I think that doesn't mean you cannot or should not make well-informed decisions. So I think sometimes everything's moving too fast is used as an excuse to not actually think critically and use evidence and data. This is a very bad thing to do. I'm going to describe a cartoon. This cartoon was in the New Yorker, I believe, some years ago. And it's supposed to be set, in the days of, the caveman, Neanderthal man and woman. Okay, so it's got, or maybe later than that, it's got a group, they're all wearing animal skins. And there's 4 people pushing a cart. And the cart has got square wheels. It's got square wheels. And they're pushing it and pushing it, and it won't move. Someone in the background is holding up, he's just made a round wheel. He says, hey, I've got a round wheel. Look, do you want this round wheel? And they say, go away, we're busy. Can't you see we're busy? We've got trying to do this thing. And I think often evidence-based practice is a bit like that. People are using the idea of being busy, or they're already trying really hard to do something, as an excuse to not look at what may actually be effective. So again, I think the idea of changing pace and innovation, I think it fits perfectly well with evidence-based practice.
That's lovely. There's a question by Professor Mahapatra who says, can evidence-based HR sometimes create tensions between what is best for an organization and what is best for its employees?
Yes, great question. Yes, it certainly can. And I think those tensions are always there. And I think the evidence-based practice process can expose those absolutely. So in the case of talking to stakeholders, you may find out that one in a group of employees feels a particular way about an issue or problem, which is not the same as another group of stakeholders like leaders and managers. And I think the key part here is to present what those views and opinions are. I would say having different perspectives, having different values, having different interests is normal. It's normal. It's not an exception. But I think the difference is here, it just brings them out a bit more. And this is a bit idealistic, but I'll say sometimes by making these data explicit, there's a chance that different groups of stakeholders start to understand a bit more the other perspective. It doesn't mean there's an easy answer, but it does mean they're more aware that we as a group of stakeholders think X, this group of stakeholders thinks Y. I don't like that, but maybe we can understand a bit more why they think that. And also the key thing is you've also got those 3 other sources of data. So sure, there might be conflicts, different expectations, different values, but you actually can look at that other data as well. It kind of puts it a bit more into context. So but you certainly can expose it, absolutely. Yeah.
Great, thank you. There is a technical-ish kind of a question where somebody is saying, can EBHR be integrated into EFQM, which is the European Framework for Quality Management, or other business models? Business excellence models.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know what EFQM is. And just give me the acronym. But I think it can be integrated into it. I would say it's maybe more the other way around, that those other things could be integrated into evidence-based HR. So the evidence-based, what I've tried to do with this model and these principles is to make it as simple as possible. And I think you can fit those other things within it in terms of kind of parts of it. I think sometimes those other frameworks, I think, are almost over-designed. They can get very, very complicated and they become a goal in themselves. Following the framework, fitting the framework becomes the ultimate goal.
Right.
The thing about evidence-based practice is the ultimate goal is always saying what's going on and what can we do about it. Now, in another way, I don't care about these frameworks. They might be useful, they might not be, but the danger is, and again, it can happen with evidence-based HR, people become more interested in the sort of doing the process and actually why they're doing it. The key thing is always, what is the purpose of this? What are we trying to do? And I think these other frameworks can absolutely be useful as well in terms of part of it. Yeah.
Just last one question. In your experience, has there been one, could you share with us one example where when you've used it or when you've helped somebody to use it, it has really made a tangible difference? I think it'll just...
There are some examples in the report. So I think I've sent you links to the evidence-based HR New Paradigm report. There's several examples in there. But one example I remember, it might sound like in a way quite a small example, but I think it made a big difference. So this was a large construction company that has projects that go on for decades, 15, 20 years. And they have senior people heading up the whole project who've obviously been with the project from the beginning. They may have been there for 8, 9, 10, 12 years. And they were having a problem with them leaving. And of course, for them, it was a big headache because they had accumulated all the knowledge and expertise of that problem. And what the company kept doing is trying to give them bonuses. They kept trying to give them rewards for staying in that role or increasing their salary. And it just didn't seem to work. So somebody who actually is familiar with this framework took this framework and applied it to the specific thing of these very senior, very well-paid project leaders and why they were leaving. And he went through the process saying, what's the problem? He went through the process of what we can do. And his sort of solution to this was actually nothing to do with money. It was nothing to do with giving them bonuses. It was nothing to do with making them stay. It turned out that when he spoke to them and looked at some of the evidence and data around why people quit, particularly leaders or quit, it's often because their jobs had got less and less interesting. So the reason they moved was not because they didn't have enough money, it's because they felt they kind of got a bit bored. Yeah. So what he did is applied a particular framework for thinking of ways of changing those roles a bit to make them more rewarding and interesting. And according to their data, it had quite a large effect on reducing turnover amongst that group. So again, the view was we just need to pay these people more money. It just wasn't working. And that's because the problem hadn't really been understood.
Sure. Thank you. That's a great example. Vishal, do you want to ask this question?
I just had a question and my own experience. Thank you for a great talk, Rob. And my own experience of interacting with leaders of organizations. I think the first step of convincing them that they need to go beyond what they think is right. I think that's the hardest thing. So, from your own experience, Rob, of doing, and what's that critical first thing that you tell to these leaders as to that there is a need to go beyond eminence or eloquence and talk about the evidence?
Fantastic question. So I think sometimes I ask leaders how they got there, how they got to be leaders, which is quite interesting. And of course, it depends on the context, depends on the setting. But often people get to be leaders because of a number of things. One is they're very good at doing stuff. They're very good at making things happen. They're probably quite good politically as well. We kind of have to be, I suppose. And they're often quite good in building relationships. Those three things have nothing to do with evidence-based practice. This is the problem. So you've got a bunch of leaders who feel very successful, and they are in some senses, but they did not get there by being evidence-based. So if you come along and say to them, the reason you're successful, good for you, well done, but now you have to operate in a different way, which is an evidence-based way, they typically don't like it very much. So what I tend to suggest to leaders in that situation is rather than think about your own career, think about the same questions. Do you want to do everything you can to help this organization be successful? And they'll go, yes, of course I do. And I go, okay, so how are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? And if you have that conversation, eventually elements of evidence-based management start coming out. Because they say things like, we've got to really help the organization by understanding its objectives, by understanding what's going to try to do. We have to understand how we're progressing towards meeting those objectives. We have to understand what we can do to make it more likely we're going to and then they go, great, this is sounding more and more like evidence-based practice. But it's almost reminding them that no matter how successful they think they are, and no matter how much they got there just by a bias to action, doing stuff, being political, that was great to get you here. But if you really want to help the organization, you have to do something a bit different now. That's normally, I'm not saying it works, but that's usually what I say.
Great. Yeah, that's a great point. All right. I think we are at a time boundary. It was lovely to have you, Rob. I guess some of the people are asking for your slides. So
yes, I will share them. Yeah, I'll send you a copy straight away. Yeah.
Thank you. And if there are anyone who wants to still ask a question, good time. Else we will let Rob go for for whatever. No, okay, Sukruti.
Thank you, Professor Rob. It was a wonderful session and extremely engaging. We are very thankful for uh, getting us here today.
Thank you.
And additionally, I'd also like to thank all our audience, everyone who made this successful. And last but not the least, our CC team that has helped us out with such wonderful, arrangements and reaching out to people. And so it was a successful session as far as I believe. And we actually received great participation. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Indeed,
Thank you.
thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for your questions. They're really great questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much.